Okay, good morning. Welcome to the Richard L. Thompson Lecture Series presented by the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies in Gainesville, Florida. Today's the fifth presentation of our ongoing lecture series based on the books of Richard L. Thompson, or Sariputta Das. We're still going through Mechanistic and Non-Mechanistic Science, published in 1981. And today, well, let's just review what we did in our last session. That was session 4. Dvija Govinda spoke about chapter 3. He presented a review of it. The chapter's Dialogue on Consciousness and the Quantum. And he explained that while discussing the contrasting worldviews between reductionists and non-reductionists, Sariputta suggests that to make a real study of consciousness, we have to take into account, take advantage of the higher cognitive potencies of the Jivatma, or the soul itself. And today we have Prishni Sutton, who will give a presentation on chapter 4, Karl Popper on the mind-body problem, a review. Prishni has a BA in mathematics and currently serves as secretary and treasurer for both the BIHS and the Richard L. Thompson archives. So go ahead, Prishni.
Okay. Hare Krishna. Okay. No, slideshow. That didn't work. Does that work?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. First, I want to thank the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies for hosting this lecture series as we introduce or reintroduce the Sariputta's books into the devotional and greater community. Somehow this, let me see if I can get this. There we go. No, I have something sitting on my screen. Why will that go away? Oh, okay. Thank you. So we're kind of in the middle of this book, Mechanistic and Non-Mechanistic Science, an investigation into the nature of consciousness and form. And as Leela said, it was originally published in 1981. Is my cursor visible? Yeah. So this is the original printing that was done in 1981, first published by Bala Books, and then a year or two later picked up by BBT, cover design by Yamaraj. Then they got 2007, Motilal Banarsidass in India got a contract with Sariputta to print them in India. And you'll notice how he just switched the subtitle with the title, which is what he did. And then they went out of print for some time. And then we got these back into print in 2017 with a new cover design by Yamaraj. And you'll notice the dominant theme here is the lotus flower. So it's consistent through all three of the designs. I'm going to be speaking about chapter 4, which is called Karl Popper on the Mind-Body Problem, a review. Just a minute here. Boop. Got my notes. And Sariputta, I'm going to step outside of what Sariputta did. I'm going to give a little more background, or a slight amount of background on Karl Popper, very famous philosopher. He was born in 1902, passed away in 1994, and he was an Austrian-British philosopher, an academic, and a social commentator. And it's said that he is regarded as one of the 20th century's most influential philosophers of science. So there he is. He had a co-author with this book, and that was John Eccles, almost exactly the same time frame, 1903 to 1997. And he comes in from a little different angle. He's an Australian, that's a different angle right there, Australian neurophysiologist and a philosopher. And he had won the Nobel Prize in 1963 in physiology or medicine for his work on the synapse. So they're putting their brains together, or their minds together, and they've developed this this theory of brain-mind interaction. This is the book they wrote. It was originally published in 1977. This cover is from the 1984 edition. And in this book, we have Popper and Eccles collaborating to develop a theory of mind-brain interaction. And this was quite a phenomenon in the day. The publisher made this little remark in their blurb. The relation between body and mind is one of the oldest riddles that has puzzled mankind. So I'm going to go through this chapter for you. It's a very short chapter, 8 pages. I'm going to give a fairly brief summary. It's not my field, but somehow I'm giving this talk. So I'm going to turn it then open to discussion. I hope it stimulates some discussion is the main purpose I have for this talk. So before getting into what Satiputta says, I kind of wanted to give everybody a slight idea of what this worldview that Popper and Eccles are supporting. And it's called the 3 worlds model. Eccles says, this is a very interesting, revealing quote, I think. He said, "I fully accept the recent philosophical achievements of Sir Karl Popper with his concept of 3 worlds. I was a dualist, and now I'm a trialist." So they've kind of switching things to this tripartite, you might say, or trialist kind of model. And let's just take a very brief look at it. So they have the 3 worlds. I'm not going to read all this little talk in here, but you can kind of look at it. World 1 is the physical objects and states. And if you slip down here, I put this other little chart down here, that correlates with the outer sense. So physical objects, outer sense. World 2 is states of consciousness. This is a little bit radical as far as scientists are concerned. So world 2, states of consciousness, and that correlates with inner sense, thoughts, feelings, memories, dreams, imaginings, intentions, all of that stuff. And then world 3 is I find a little enigmatic here. World 3 is knowledge in objective sense. And so that's a tough one. They correlated interestingly with pure ego or the self. That's just how they do it. So I wanted you to know that before we got started on the chapter. So that's the kind of, paradigm they're working in. I'll just do it this way. Works that way. Okay. So Satiputta, this book comes in 3 parts. The first part by Karl Popper, second part by John Eccles, and then the third part they worked on together. He just looks at the first part. Just part 1, which is written entirely by Karl Popper. And he states this in the very beginning of the chapter. He said, Popper's aim is to establish that the fundamental features of personality, such as consciousness, thought, emotion, and purposeful action, are not simply patterns of chemical interaction, as much as current scientific and philosophical thinking would have it, but rather aspects of a real yet non-physical entity called the mind. And I want to emphasize that word non-physical because it comes up again and again and creates a few problems in the theory. So he says there's 2 main ideas in this section of the book. So Popper begins by talking about the nature of mind. And he brings in right away this concept, it was new at the time, called emergent evolution. And Satiputta explains that this is the cornerstone of his philosophy of mind, emergent evolution. So what does that mean? It means entirely new and unpredictable qualities, processes, and laws can emerge, and he puts that in quotes, emerge spontaneously in nature and thereby completely transform the character of reality. So then the second important part here is mind's temporal origin. And again, let me emphasize temporal. It means it happens at a certain point in time. So it's temporal origin. And what Popper is claiming is that the mind emerged along with life. Okay, that's what he says. And here's the 3 qualities he lists that are absolutely critical for the mind to have. It has to be real, like electrons are real. You don't see them, but they're really there. It has to be independent of the brain, or otherwise it's just pure reductionism. And it has to have properties completely different from matter, or how can it have any causal relationship? So those are his 3, qualities that he needs to have connected with his mind. Okay. So then he gives a reason, and this is, I think, the weakest spot of all scientific understanding, that somehow the mind is just, an epiphenomenon or something. that it doesn't really exist. And he uses these things, which we can look at. Non-physical mind must influence matter. It means it's not just some epiphenomena because, and he lists these five things that happen in human life that we all agree happen. And then there's really, no one's come up with an adequate way to explain how that could happen if the mind doesn't influence matter. So let's look first at desire, and examples given here of people climbing Mount Everest. So you see everybody who's ever gotten to the top of Mount Everest in a little row here in this image. And Sariputta asked the question, why would some entity detach himself from his natural substrate and willfully go up into such a hostile environment? This issue of desire then is very hard to explain in mechanistic terms. Purpose is another one. Why does a bird build a nest? What's its purpose? I'm going to skip this one and hit that one last. Aesthetics, again, a very obvious sense. Here's, most famous painting in the world, right, in the Sistine Chapel. And Sariputta says, are Michelangelo's works simply the result of molecular movements? When you put it like that, it's just kind of hard to imagine how molecules moving around would produce something that beautiful. And the big bugbear here, which is right in the middle, moral standards. This is where scientists that I've known really run into a problem because, if you're going to have a moral standard, then that really implies that mind can influence matter, because otherwise, how do you hold someone accountable? Why are there jails? Why are there juries? Why are there courts? You're holding a person, every culture has to hold a person accountable for their actions. But if mind has no influence over matter, it's very hard to justify that. Okay. Then Popper does something I think is really interesting. Having studied science a lot, of course, all scientists like to use Occam's razor. Occam's razor is formulated first in the 13th century by this monk, William of Ockham. There's a lovely picture of him in stained glass. And it runs like this. All things being equal, the simplest solution tends to be the best one. And so that's a really extremely useful way to read through a whole, session, a whole bunch of hypotheses. Which one's most likely? Probably the simplest one. But Popper comes in here and says, beware of Occam's razor, because it can lead to what he calls promissory materialism. Okay, and we'll get back to that at the very end. But what he kind of means by that is that if you use Occam's razor, you're just going to use the simplest explanation. He says you're cutting off healthy inquiry by prematurely imposing a rigid view based on known physical properties. So he's very keen that we don't, he doesn't want the reductionists to swoop in with Occam's razor and cut all this discussion out. So I thought that was very interesting. And it's going to come in, actually it comes in and kind of bites him at the end, you're going to see. But he does have to start out with that. The next really interesting concept that Popper talks about here, that and Sariputta certainly highlights it, is something he calls downward causation. And this is where Sariputta just really, criticizes him very highly at the very end when he does his critique. This means that when many parts combine to make a whole, the whole is an entity in and of itself and is capable of acting on each of its parts individually. So the example that they give is the life cycle of a star. So you have the life cycle of star starts as a bunch of little parts, right? A nebula is just a bunch of gas, and somehow or other by the laws of nature coalesces into a very tight thing that we call a star. And once it gets the status of being a star, now it's a whole entity. And now the star itself starts directing what's going on of the parts that it's made out of. So it starts as a bunch of parts that are incoherent. Somehow or other, it coalesces into something that's a whole entity. And now that entity, the star itself, is directing in its turn what happens inside itself. So you have things going on. The star itself is causing, this whole is causing the parts to act differently. And so you have I'm not a astrophysicist, but things start to happen in the nucleus of the star, and things start to condense, they overheat, all kinds of things happen. And then you have a whole life cycle going on with this star. And somehow in the middle of this life cycle, it became a whole entity unto itself. And I'm going to mention this now, and we'll come back to it again at the end. What Sariputta comments here is that this concept of downward causation amounts to a deceptive way of introducing higher entities into the material picture, and is simply a disguised form of reductionism. It's quite a comment, but you can see, and you can really see it here. Instead of saying that the living entity, the life force of the mind, was there all along, he's saying right here that somehow that when the parts get to a certain stage, they're now a whole and is an entity unto itself. And he kind of sneaks it in, and that's why Sariputta calls it a deceptive way of introducing. And this is another real problem that we come up with if we're going to operate theories of mind within the context of Darwinian theory. So the mechanism that I think Popper feels compelled to use for this emerging, evolution of mind is natural selection. And Sariputta says it's actually the basic principle underlying the development of mind, according to Popper. So how is it that this mind is coming out? And here's these two statements you're going to see kind of show the problem with this using natural selection vis-a-vis the mind. So Popper maintains that at one time the universe consisted solely of matter interacting with itself according to laws similar to or identical with those studied by the physicists. Okay, so let's accept that. But then he goes on and he says, yet mind is a totally novel emergent entity that cannot be reduced to a combination of material elements. And this is where the problem comes up in this theory. I think you can see it right in these two. Right away, if you look at it like this, you can see something's not fitting. But we'll go into it a little more. So at this point, Sariputta gets into his critique. And he starts out with the standard evolutionary theory. So and somehow or other, Popper feels compelled, because it was such a dominant paradigm, that he must fit this thing in the standard evolutionary theory. But Sariputta comments he's actually rejecting this. And you can run through his arguments here, very simple arguments. First of all, Popper's saying the mind is real and that it is independent of the brain. Okay? He says its properties are completely different from those of matter. Now, okay, so what's the conclusion? His attempt to reconcile this view with a theory of evolution has actually only shown that the evolutionary theory is unable to account for the origin of mind. I think he just hits this one out of the park, and then he gets a little stronger here. Popper has distorted the standard neo-Darwinian theory of evolution almost beyond recognition. Emergent evolution raises more questions than it answers. So that's his first critique. Secondly, I can't see that. There we go. He brings in this concept and this pre-existing higher laws. This is a version of his original monograph, the third monograph he did in 1977, Demonstration by Information Theory that Life Cannot Arise from Matter. And he uses this argument, it's called the complexity argument. So we have these pre-existing higher laws. Well, there has to, and then he says, so where are these pre-existing laws? Do they have to be there? Yes. Because something has to regulate the emergence, which in this case for Popper is the mind. So we have the mind kind of emerging out, but it has qualities that weren't in matter. So you have to have some kind of higher laws which incorporate the qualities and features that appear in this emergent entity, again, which in this case would be the mind. So it doesn't, he doesn't directly discuss pre-existing higher laws, but if you look at it, it implies the existence of higher laws, because where else does this information come from? Mm-hmm. It wasn't there to begin with, now suddenly it's there. So this is if you look at Sadhuputa's argument, he says emergent evolution requires the existence of laws that already embody the qualities equal or superior to those supposedly novel qualities and properties that may emerge. So there it is. And then I love this comment. It is an attempt to carry out the impossible task of accepting reductionism and rejecting it at the same time. And this is why we study Sadhuputa. He gets in there, right? He goes right to the heart of the problem, both mathematically, because he does a whole mathematical analysis of this in his monograph. But he gets to the heart of the issue, I think, philosophically as well. So you have it's almost as though this kind of thinking is acting against itself from the get-go. And then finally, he gets into the downward causation, which was the problem with the star. And he calls it simply a disguised form of reductionism. And here he says it very bluntly. This concept of downward causation amounts to a deceptive way of introducing high entities into the material picture without really introducing them. Kind of sneaks them in. He said a physicist would immediately reply regarding the star lifetime. We immediately reply that the behavior of the star can be fully explained in principle in terms of the material interaction of its component parts without any reference at all to the star as a whole. So, and then here's the rub. So now Popper's really left without much to stand on. Now, at the very end, now Sadhuput brings us all together, and he's looking, what's the real problem in this approach? What is the essence of the problem? And I think he nails it on this one. He says, Popper tends to speak of the self in rather vague and reductionist terms as some kind of pattern of interaction between mind and the body. So the self has no identity. That's what it really boils down. So he isolates the problem there. And then the solution he gives, I think is lovely. If we suppose that there are laws of nature governing the emergence of consciousness, then we must conclude that nature has inherent features falling outside the realm of the discourse of physics. So there it is right there. If you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't, if you're going to take your argument, all of the stuff that you're doing, you know, all the mechanism for developing this mind is within the physical realm, then, you know, then you wind up in this contradiction. So he's suggesting we suppose that there are laws of nature governing emergence that are inherent features of reality. The simplest hypothesis about such features is, of course, and here comes, so Sadhuputta now uses Occam's razor here. The simplest hypothesis about such features is, of course, that consciousness itself is an inherent feature of reality and not an emergent property. And we can all give a nice applaud to Sadhuputta for that, because that's really where I think most of people right now engaged in this debate are going with that, is that you can't explain it away. You can't explain it with physical processes, and you can't say it's not there. So we're really left with that. And the final conclusion, and this is also delightful, that Sadhuputta comes up with, if we can candidly consider that the self may be a real conscious entity in a world with inherent meaning and purpose, we may hope to come to a practical and coherent worldview that does violence neither to reason nor to our natural spiritual aspirations. All right, Krishna. I want to say one thing before I sign off, though, and that let me go back to that conclusion. This little one sentence blurb here doesn't really outline much, but if you want to get more of this way more developed form of this, if you can go to the Richard L. Thompson Archives website, which is sadhuputta.com. And if you go to the audio section, you're going to find right near the top a transcript, an audio and a transcript also of a talk he gave about 10 years after he wrote this book, 1990 in San Francisco at a BI conference there. And the talk is called, let's get my notes, I don't have it memorized. It's called Free Will and the Laws of Physics. So he's really getting down to it. So how is this free will operating within the laws of physics? Because that was the problem we came up with here. You want to follow the laws of physics, but how do you get, you know, any of these properties that physical elements don't have into the picture? And so it's free will and the laws of physics, a trans-temporal approach to mind-brain interaction. I think it's an excellent talk. So if you you can tune in to that. Okay, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I know there's more people in the room with me who know more about this, and I hope some of the others who are attending have either questions or comments to make.
Hey, thank you very much, Prishni, and we'll open it up to questions and comments. You can unmute yourself. You can also post your question in the chat or raise a hand. Okay. I see a hand go up. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm Pranavadas from Sweden, Stockholm. Thank you for this nice presentation, very clear about Sariputta and mechanistic and non-mechanistic science. I had a question about we discussed the body, we discussed the consciousness, and there is of course a science, Sankhya, let's say Sankhya philosophy that explains we have Atman, Purusha, a spiritual entity. We have the body, material body with the five senses and the whole body. And then we have these subtle elements, such as, for example, ahankara, the mind, the buddhi, the intelligence, and so on. So three different elements. So my question is a bit, is there any kind of research about the second element? The third one about that we have a soul is come from Plato, is a very old philosophy behind it. The idea that we have a body is quite clear. You mentioned a third way, and it seems like you're referring to a subtle body with the mind, with intelligence, with ahankara, with our false ego. But can we? Is there a way to explain it? Because that would mean that we have in the body we have three parts, three sections in the body: the physical body, the subtle body, which is not visible, and then the Atman here in the heart. Does it make sense? How can we present it? Or is there a need to have some more research about it? Just a question.
That's a fantastic question, right to the moment. And I'm going to turn to Christina to give an answer to that. She is actually working with the Atma paradigm right now, which deals with that very question. So you will answer that, Christina?
Sure. Thank you very much, Prishni.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation, and thank you very much, Prabhu, for the question. So I would say the work I'm doing right now is I'm sort of the junior member on the team led by Akanda Dijas Prabhu to write a book for general distribution by the BPT on the nature of consciousness and the sort of these basic tenets of Vedic philosophy, and how we see these different parts of the self, as you talked about. So I think the key here, so I have linguistics training. I was my BA is in linguistics. So I think the key here in the current kind of cultural atmosphere is to avoid the word spirit and avoid the word soul. And so what we're doing is really focusing on this term consciousness and really trying to differentiate consciousness from consciousness and its functions. And here we can kind of refer to Satchidananda or Jiva Goswami's axioms of, I exist, I desire pleasure, that sort of thing, and kind of separate that from, okay, what is the mind, and proving that there is a separation by referring to self-help books and therapy and these things that are very popular these days, where it's like you're learning how to observe your mind, you're learning how to cope with your mind, and that really implies, if you're trying to cope with something, that implies that that thing is not you. So that's something that I would that's what I would say in answer to your question, that like first of all, it is clear that there's a physical body, and then there's non-physical elements to who we are, and then the next step is to is to isolate and clarify the difference between what is the mind and then what is the consciousness in terms of functionality, and not so much in terms of a reference to, you know, spirit or soul or these concepts which come with a lot of baggage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can I just make a comment about it? Because
sure.
The challenge when we're discussing about the mind, for example, which is there in Sankhya, is that the mind is we are not this body, but we're not the mind either. So that's a challenge. We are not this mind. We are not the ego. We're not the buddhi, the intelligence at all. It's separate from us. It's a material element, basically. So I understand what you say about not presented the soul, but speaking about consciousness. I understand also what you mentioned, discussing the mind. But is there also a need to explain also for those who want to philosophically at least understand the mind, that the mind actually is external, is a product of matter, has nothing to do really with the consciousness in a sense, because we mix the consciousness with the mind when we have a material body naturally. Just a thought. Just
oh yes. And that's kind of what I was alluding to when I talked about, you know, the reference to like self-help books and therapy, coping with the mind, implying that you are not the mind. So this approach is the purpose of looking at the difference between the mind and the consciousness is to then say, well, which do you think you really are? And to sort of prove, or basically to prove that it is more accurate and more productive to identify with the consciousness functions as opposed to the mental functions, and that when you identify with the consciousness functions, then you see these effects in how you see yourself in the world that just like really make things better. Like the one example is the friend-enemy distinction, right? There's we learn in Bhagavad Gita and the Shastra that this duality is a result of identifying with the body and the mind. And you can also talk about this without reference to Shastra by saying, well, what is the root of thinking of someone as an enemy? And if you really think about it, well, you know, an enemy is someone that, let's say, threatens you in some way or provides some kind of obstacle to you getting what you want. If you really think about what that means, all they're doing is threatening you on the body or the mind platform, and they can't threaten what you actually are, which is consciousness. Nobody can take away your ability to exist, to think, and to desire pleasure. So yes, I definitely agree with you, and it is really important to make that distinction as well, but also to point out that even though we are not our body and mind, and we know it's not productive to identify as the body and mind, they're still important tools for the consciousness to use. So yes, I totally agree with you.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Hare Krishna.
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you, Christina, for elaborating. We have a hand up by Edwin Bryant. Advaita Prabhu, welcome. Go ahead, please.
Oh yeah, Krishna, I'm so sorry I missed the talk. I spaced out. You know, I honestly, I just spaced out. I was intending to be there, and what can I tell you? Good old Hare Krishna 60s language. I spaced out.
But it is recorded.
Oh, okay, excellent. But Ferdinanda Prabhu, I'm sorry. What's your devotee name? Did you say
Yeah, my name is Pranava.
Pranava. Okay, I know we've had exchanges in the past. Yeah, it's Hare Krishna. I think one, you know, I what I'm hearing in your question is maybe why do we posit a mind in the first place? I mean, there's plenty of arguments to say that consciousness must be distinct from matter, right? So. Because if we say it's neurological, well, what's a neuron ultimately but a bunch of atoms, right? What are atoms but a bunch of subatomic particles? So we have to identify, is it one particular atom? In which case, what do we gain from saying it's not a soul? If it's a special kind of atom that produces consciousness, then we might as well just, you know, call it a soul. But if it's a conglomerate of atoms, then, well, what does that mean? Is it 1,000 atoms? What happens if we take one away and there's only 999? So we can clearly make strong arguments as to why consciousness is distinct from matter. But I think what I'm hearing from you is, why do we have to posit a soul? Why can't we just take a Platonic model and say that thinking is another quality of the Atman, just like consciousness is a quality? Well, why can't thinking and ego and the rest of it And that's where I think it's useful to engage Indian philosophy, because Sankhya and Nyaya, by the way, which has a different model, but they would both agree, and they would say something like, if you didn't have a mind, your consciousness would be conscious of all the senses simultaneously. There would be nothing filtering. You need something to filter the impetuses or impeti coming in through the five senses. Now, if there was no organism that's controlling that, that's sort of filtering that, that's determining what's important, what to pay attention to, you would be aware of all five senses. There would be nothing you could do. Your consciousness would be flooded with five types of sense mechanisms. So I think that's one of the primary arguments as to why one must posit a mind in the first place. Now, then what is the mind? What does it do? That's a secondary question. But first, it seems one has to establish the need for an intermediary entity, and that is external to consciousness. It can't be a property of consciousness, because then, for the reasons I just stated, then it would be aware of all five sense stimuli at the same time. So it has to be a filter that's external to consciousness. And therefore, if we accept that, then we've accepted a subtle body, and then we can go in and refine, well, what does the subtle body do? What doesn't it do, etc. But first, we need to be clear about why posit the need for a subtle body in the first place.
Can I make a little comment about
Yeah.
Discussing about this very important point. Since you, what Advaita is your name?
Yes,
Advaita?
yes, Guru, yeah.
Nice to
So you translated one of my articles into Italian. Ma tu sei italiano, no?
Yeah, parlo italiano, naturalmente.
Io sono italiano da Roma, nato a Roma.
Scusa. Bene. I have a question connected to that, because we talk about Yoga Sutra. You wrote the commentary to Yoga Sutra, but just a little point about it, because if you read the Yoga Sutra, for example, if you read the yoga philosophy, they speak about the subtle body. You mentioned that the subtle body. The subtle body should be, and that's my question really. Because you discussed about philosophy, that's fine, but is there also a level where we can, for example, explain to scholars even, that the view of the yoga is that we have our subtle body, which is as big as our material body, is very small. In terms, the weight of the subtle body is very light. It's not like 80 kilos, 90 kilos. But it's definitely full of energy, it's full of, and there is, of course, the Kundalini yoga, where there is the nadi, the channels of the body, the prana, the word of prana, which is there in Yoga Sutra also. The energy that we have in the body is subtle, but we can develop it through, for example, breathing, for example, with different exercises. We can increase the subtle body, which is there, which is as big as our physical body, but it's subtle. You cannot see it, obviously, but you can feel it, because it's there. So just a little thought, philosophy, that's very fine, but is there also a way to explain the mind and the subtle body in a way which is more accessible, or maybe a way to start some research about it? Because as far as I know, there is no research at all about the subtle body. So just a question.
Why wouldn't that be a topic of philosophy? Look, if we accept that the gross body is just dull matter, it's mahabhuta, right? It's just atoms. And if you accept that consciousness is passive and can do nothing, right? It's energy. It's just conscious energy. All right. It may be an agent. It may have free will. It may have agenthood. So on the one hand, you have a passive entity that's just providing consciousness. On the other hand, you just have a conglomerate of dead matter. Now you need something in between to energize and activate the body, and that's the indriyas are sometimes called shaktis. In the Sankhya, in the traditional Sankhya, we have the 10, the karmendriyas, the jnanendriyas, the 10 indriyas, but elsewhere they're called the 10 shakti. Shakti means to empower, to shak, to allow something to do something. And elsewhere again, they're called pranas. So you can call them pranas or shaktis or indriyas. So you need something. So first of all, we have to establish why there needs to be a a subtle body, but that may be philosophy. But I mean, before we start talking about the function of the subtle body, we have to establish the need for it. But then take that a step further. What is it? What is the interface between a dead lump of flesh and consciousness, which in and of itself can do nothing? Maybe it has will, but even if it exerts will, it can't do anything. So you need a sort of energetic, call it pranic, call it indriya, call it shakti. You need an energetic system that interfaces, picks up the will from the Atman, and then energizes the gross physical body. So I think that is philosophy, perhaps, or, you know, it's, why wouldn't that be philosophy? I mean, these are all inferences. We're making inferences at this point. Sankhya is a system of complete system of inferences. We're inferring the need for, because you can't see it, as you say, right? And if someone is not willing to accept the Shastra, then the only other epistemology we have left is inference. So Sankhya is an inferential system. It never quotes a single verse from the scripture. So you can infer the need for some type of an intermediary entity. It seems to me. So it's not a waste of time to study philosophy, I guess is what I'm saying.
Let me charge in here just for a minute, because actually, I think you actually do, as a Bhaktivedanta Institute, do need to study the subtle body. And Murali Gopal actually has done some preliminary work on that, and he's actually using some. This is not my field at all, but he's using some tantric stuff, which involves pranayama and all kinds of things. And there actually are ways to measure this stuff. You can measure these changes of energy on the subtle platform. It can be done. It can be, you can do empiric investigations on it. I know right here at UF, a friend of mine works he's a computer scientist, and they have a lab where they put little electrodes on people's heads and they fly drones all over the room using their mental energy. So there are ways to measure this. I agree, we haven't done nearly enough, and I also agree, Adwaita, that you have to establish a need for it philosophically. But from a just purely scientific point of view, yeah, you can study it. And Sadhuputta, someone once asked him, why is there no evidence of all this other energy? And he said, there's tons of evidence. However, it hasn't been gone through systematically because it's generally considered pseudoscience, paranormal, all these kinds of things. And he said other cultures always accepted these energies as being real, but modern scientific culture tends to reject all that. And so he says, of course, he did a whole book on UFOs. Why? He said, because that topic is taboo. It's never been studied. No academic will touch it. So all we have is all these, reports that come in completely disorganized, and people take advantage of the fact that there's no study done on this stuff and create all kinds of make-up stuff, and the whole thing's just a mess. So, but that doesn't mean the evidence isn't there. It just means it's being ignored or not being analyzed properly. So that would one answer to that. That helps.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anyone else? Any comments? I see something in the chat. Let's see.
Let me say something, if I might.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, there are two themes that are here that are we have to reconcile. One is it all philosophical, or is it all evidence-based? Now, Sariputta took the middle road. Same thing. I think we all ought to be good Buddhists that way and take the middle road on this one. The thing is, there is evidence. I mean, the evidence is always questioned. We have like the one that many of us at BI know very intimately is the PAIR project at Princeton, which kind of demonstrated that the mind may be non-material. And I didn't know it, but I listened to a lecture by Dean Radin yesterday that he had given at Hamroff's conference last year. And there was quite a few confirming experiments replicating that work. I didn't know that part. So that was new to, so we have these things that are kind of on the edge, like University of Virginia's Department of Perceptual Studies, which we're getting closer and closer contacts with. The BI actually explores these issues. At the same time, it is, and I think Advaita is correct, underlying, there's a philosophical metaphysics that needs to be looked at, because without that, if we compare ourselves to Gajendra and the crocodile, we are deep in the water without the philosophy. Yet, if we want to demonstrate to the world the chapter 2 of the Gita, we're not this body, we're going to need some physical evidence. So how to balance these two? If we jump into just the physical evidence side, it's always going to be questioned. If we dump into the philosophical side, we can say, so what? Because people are not very good philosophers nowadays. Anyway, that's just my comment on it. They're both on there. I think Prishni agrees with me on it. Some may disagree, which is fine. Well, what does Janaki think? John, this is an area Janaki thinks a lot about.
Did Prishni leave?
No,
Uh,
Prishni's here.
I'm here.
Oh, she's there.
I don't like being on camera, but here I am.
Okay. Well, I missed the first part of the talk, unfortunately. I just caught the last little bit. What was the issue?
This is we were talking about the fourth chapter in Mechanistic and Non-Mechanistic Science, which is a review of a book written by Popper and Eccles, which you might be familiar with, the self and the body, or whatever it's called. Anyway, and so it's just a review that Sadhuputta did, and he discussed this emergence evolution and what the problems with that, where he said that Popper is basically trying to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to, tie into the all-encompassing, all-popular Darwinian system of natural selection for his emergent mind, but then he winds up in trouble at the end, because he needs to bring in new qualities the mind has that are not material, and yet it emerges out of something that is material. So that's the quandary that Popper's work exposes to us. And so we were discussing how different ways to deal with that, and then Advaita very nicely. It was actually Pranava was wondering what's this third and this middle one, the mind. How does that fit in? It's physical, but it's subtle. And then Advaita mentioned, really, you have to philosophically establish the need, that there actually is a need for this intermediary energy between the soul and matter, or the entity, the soul, would be totally overwhelmed by matter, because all five senses would be inputting simultaneously without a filter. So that's where the discussion was going.
Sounds good. Sounds good. It's a lot's happened since Popper, so it would be good to think about. I don't know. One question I might have is, does this conversation that you've looked at, does it have any contemporary voices? There's people out there that are continuing this discussion. Who are they? And secondly, does what you have talked about there, does it have something to contribute to that? I'm sure there is. I'm going to guess. I'm just going to take a wild guess that there is. People continue to debate, epiphenomena and the nature of mind and consciousness and the mind-body relationship. And now it's really about the brain. What role does the brain have with subjective experience? But it would be good to go into that literature that's kind of in the contemporary journals and book publications and stuff like that, and see if what you're saying can connect with that. Does that make sense?
And matter of fact, I don't know if Christina is actually working on this project right now. Do you have something to say about contemporary? Because I haven't looked at any.
No, I haven't personally. Honestly, Tom Parney is really kind of the guy for that. I'm Akandadi as well. They're very good at like reviewing the literature. I'm sort of, I'm the one who puts the words on the paper, but I'm very much guided by their visions. But I would throw it back to BT because he actually talks to a lot of these people himself.
I mean, it's absolutely correct. There's two conferences coming up in May and June in which these topics are being discussed. And I'm preparing a delegation to at least one of them from the BI, which the folks who are really leading edge on this are discussing these topics, because we need to be up to date, what's gone on. I mean, Karl Popper is kind of old news now, but the ideas some of them are still intellectually relevant. So one of the conferences is in New York, the other's in Italy. And we have some people in Europe. I'm hoping maybe can get into the Italian conference. We'll see. In New York, we're going to send a delegation. And anybody who's interested in attending or would like to know more about the conferences, send me a note. I'll let you know. There's even might be some BI funding available to help with expenses. So let me know. And we'll see. Unless we're in the middle of the intellectual discussions, we'll be irrelevant.
Okay,
We
thank
have to
you,
be up to date.
Thank you. I want to read, I think that was my curiosity too, is has anyone refuted this emergent evolution theory by Popper since then? I don't know, but I'd be curious to find out. And I want to read this from Langa Ganesha Das in the chat. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita that of all the senses, I, Krishna, am the mind. As the emergent source of the primordial soup, he is also the predisposition or utility of the ingredients. The mind, Krishna, in the subtle physical form, has only three functions: thinking, feeling, and willing. We, the individual entrapped within the snare of illusory perception, can only accept or reject the subjective thinking, feeling, and willing. By acceptance of the willing impetus, we move our external form to express the subtle options offered by the mind. And I'm also going to add to the chat what was mentioned by Sariputta, the trans-temporal approach to the mind-body interaction. Okay, is there anyone else? Any other comments, questions?
I do want to say, I thought Prishni took a short but difficult chapter and made it very clear. You did a very good job, Prishni. It's really, it's one of the harder chapters to deal with.
Yes, and it's certainly not my field. So I took the plunge.
And you stepped in and you can just tell that you've created some discussion. Those who missed this, the conversation, this is recorded. And if you write Prishni, she can connect you with the recording.
I have a comment. My overall impression of Karl Popper is that I just kind of feel a little bad for him. Like he just seems, he's out there and he's one of these like leading minds of the world, and yet what Sariputta sort of exposes is that there are these fundamental contradictions in the way that he's thinking about the self and the mind and how to relate to this dominant paradigm of Darwinian evolution. And so he kind of trips over himself. Like, he says, Sariputta says that Popper, he describes the self as this vague entity, but then in other places he says, no, the self is like an actual, a thing. And it just kind of evokes just a feeling of sort of compassion that, wow, if only he'd had the Bhagavad Gita and could really have kind of a firm rock to stand on in trying to iron out the contradictions of this theory, because it's never fun to have these contradictions when this is like your life's work.
Thank you, Christina. Anyone else? Any other comments or concerns? Questions? Okay, so we'll be back in 2 weeks. On Saturday, April 15th, for a presentation on chapter 5. So that is Information Theory and the Self-Organization of Matter by Dvija Govinda, who has he has multiple PhD degrees. He was with us 2 weeks ago in acoustics and computational mathematics, and he is a professional in the field of telecommunications and has been teaching Vedic mathematics and other courses in the Kiev Krishna Consciousness Academy since 2013. Also, all the prior lectures are uploaded on our YouTube channel. We'll put a link to that, and today's will also go up shortly. So thank you very much. Thank you for your attendance and for your questions and comments. We will see you in 2 weeks, and thank you very much, Prishni.
My
Like this
my
chat.
pleasure.